So, Benny Boy Shapiro, Ben Sharper Image, Ben Brat Piro, is literally doing a response video. So this is just content-ception. Debunking the viral Systemic Racism Explained video. Benny Boy, take it away.
Okay, so there's a video that is going around on Facebook and on YouTube. It's from ACT TV called Systemic Racism Explained. Makes some interesting arguments, and I thought it's worthwhile going through them a little bit. So we're going to play the video, we'll stop it, we'll discuss. This video is sponsored by the Benham Brothers brand new course, Expert Ownership. You can learn to own a business without it owning you.
African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to...
Keep in mind, this is one of the things that we want to redirect the funding of the police to, is funding schools so that they have up-to-date equipment and up-to-date curriculum, that they don't have 30 or 40 kids per teacher, so that each student can get one-on-one time with the teacher, and also so that the teacher doesn't have to spend as much of their money on getting the supplies they need for their kids. I mean, there's a comic going around here. Yeah, this one right here. Nice body armor. I have to buy my own chalk. This is what we're talking about here.
High quality tutors or extracurricular activities.
Yes, Dodge. I'm taking down a takedown. Takedown-ception.
Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities.
So let's talk for a second about school policy. The reality is that if you wanted Jamal to be able to go to Kevin's school, what you'd want is something called school vouchers. You want people to be able to move away from their school districts. One of the chief reasons
that doesn't improve the schools that are underfunded, Ben. That just means that they get less funding. So they continue to get worse. This is something that I see a lot of right libertarians do, a lot of conservatives in general do. They talk about what individuals can do to improve their position, ignoring that doesn't fix the systemic issues. And if someone is unable to get such a voucher, say the vouchers run out, or they don't do vouchers in their cities, or what have you, then it doesn't help those people who are stuck in their position. This is the same as well, what are people going to do who live on these coasts if global warming, raises the coastline? Well, they'll just sell their houses. To fucking who, Ben? Aquaman? Yes, joke stolen entirely from H. Bomber Guy.
that Jamal is confined to his local public school.
Hey, at least it wasn't a dog whistling, it wasn't a denial of the problem. He's an idiot, but not for the reason I normally expect from old Benny. Plus, he's acting as though white schools don't actively try and prevent the poors from coming in. True, yeah.
Is because of democratic policy that has decided that you must go to school in the district where you live. And this is also why a lot of people have left lower income areas.
Yes. Because if your property taxes are going to fund a school, you want to go to the school your property taxes are funding. What we on the left want is to maybe make sure that there's more funding in addition to property taxes, so that there isn't this sharp divide between wealthy neighborhoods, schools in wealthy neighborhoods, and schools in poor neighborhoods. It's really that simple.
Areas and moved out to higher income areas specifically for better public schools. So if you want Jamal to have the same educational opportunities as Kevin, perhaps you should have school vouchers for private schools, or perhaps you should have charter schools, which is what made...
Ugh, charter schools, yes. The private schools funded by public education, and so they have less oversight than public schools. That's a really, really good thing. Not. Supposedly, 4 kids from the Howard family were going to transfer. There was literally an apocalypse in Eldridge to prevent it. The Karens won. Doesn't surprise me about Eldridge.
Mayor Bill de Blasio in New York is fighting against, or perhaps he should break the teachers' unions, which are costing a fortune, particularly on a disproportionate level in areas where...
Ah, yes, bust up teachers' unions so that they can't, because all those teachers who are getting paid six-figure... Wait. No, most teachers make like sub 30K. Teachers get paid shit compared to their importance in kids' lives. Like, everyone has a good teacher who, to some degree or another, inspired them. And I guarantee that teacher was making shit relative to what they should be made for their impact on people's lives.
where they're not spending enough taxpayer dollars. So I'm all for improving Jamal's schools. I'm also all for Jamal having all the same educational opportunities as Kevin. The problem is most Democrats are not.
Kevin and Jamal live only a
And again, he's making this a Democrat issue instead of acknowledging that it's a systemic issue which both parties have sought to strengthen and reinforce.
few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents.
In order to understand what's going to happen in this video, you have to understand how systemic racism is being defined. Systemic racism is really a amorphous term. It could mean many things. It could mean that the institution...
It's not, though, Ben. Systemic racism is specifically the idea that the system, whether deliberately through deliberate conscious action or accidentally through policies and means testing, creates racist outcomes. So I've heard it described there's basically 3 kinds of racism we can deal with. There's explicit racism, which is, the Ku Klux Klan, the N-word, profiling black people, assuming they're going to steal from you when they walk into your store, that kind of thing. Then there's implicit racism, which is much more subtle. It's the kind of thing like, oh God, what are some good examples of implicit racism? Well, the assumption that black people are just more prone to criminality and violence. The assumption that Native Americans are just lazy drunks who just want to live on their reservation and not do anything. So that's implicit racism. This idea that it's not that they're worse. It's just that they're just, that's how they're raised or whatever. This idea that black people need to stop being ghetto and stop with the gang banging and drug dealing and get a good job, and it's just all their fault. It's not that they're inferior, it's just they need to fix themselves. That's implicit racism. And then there's racism by act, which is where whatever your intention, you end up creating a racism. All of these are factors in the systemic racism, whether it's explicitly racist people, denying things to minorities, whether it's implicit racism by assuming that minorities wouldn't qualify for something like this or wouldn't do well at it, or racism by act where you deny resources to an area because you just don't have the money, and it ends up exacerbating issues in a majority minority area. It's one thing that people don't seem to get. Just because a system wasn't set up to be racist doesn't automatically mean it isn't. Exactly. And the means testing and the way our system is set up, where schools are funded by property taxes, means that even though on paper the system is entirely race blind, there's nothing in our system or laws or rules that says that Black schools get less, should are do less funding. But by keeping the system as it is, where it's funded by property taxes and not doing anything to improve these neighborhoods, you've effectively created a system where people in poor neighborhoods, black and white, are at a disadvantage compared to people in wealthy neighborhoods, black or white. And again, this is where the hyper individualism of particularly Ben's brand of libertarian conservatism comes in, because individuals can escape this. An exceptional individual is an exception. That's why they're called exceptional. They will escape this no matter, a lot of people will overcome the obstacles in their path. The problem is those obstacles shouldn't exist. Yeah, exactly, Dodge. Property taxes funding schools wasn't set up to be malicious. It just became that way due to ghettoing people. Yeah. Redlining and the way that, especially prior to the Civil Rights Act, the way minorities trying to purchase homes in certain areas would be discouraged from doing so, either explicitly or subtly, led to these areas where poor minorities gathered in certain areas, and those areas just became poorer and poorer, and they stayed out of wealthier areas, which became wealthier and wealthier, and whiter and whiter.
Institutions of today are racist, in which case everyone would oppose them. Or it could mean that all inequality is explainable by racism, which of course is not sustainable. It's not a good argument. The argument that this video is going to try to make is that all of history has meaning. And that is true. History does have consequences for today. The problem is,
it's worth mentioning that there are people alive today, people who haven't even reached retirement age, who lived under Jim Crow. That means that their great-grandparents were either slaves or children of slaves. So the effects of the past, my great-grandparents, let's see, on my mom's side, I don't remember what my great-grandma's, they were farmers. At least on my mom's side, they were farmers, Nebraska farmers. Do you know how many black farmers there were in turn-of-the-century Nebraska? Not many. And most of them would have been what we refer to as sharecroppers, which is basically a form of slavery. And on my dad's side, great-grandpa was I know he was in the military. He went to Japan in World War II. In fact, I remember after he died, we heard that Grandpa bought 3 things back from Japan. Japanese sniper rifle, a scar from a Japanese sniper rifle, the sniper rifle that gave him the scar, and a bayonet. And I have the bayonet. I assume the sniper rifle disappeared somewhere along the way. Probably was sold or stolen or something. But the point is that I'm white. My family is mostly white. There's some Native American blood that surfaces every generation or so. But we didn't have to deal with the kind of things that black people had to deal with, given that, many black people my age, their grandparents, their great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents were actual chattel slaves. And that they lived under Jim Crow for half a century. And that has a lot of effects on people. A lot of things that people ignore. And even once we dealt with Jim Crow, we went right into the war on drugs, which has also not been great for the black community. Oh, he's sudden and baseless leaps of logic. Oh yeah, that's Ben Shapiro in a nutshell, Dodge.
as we'll see, the video tries to explain all inequality with reliance on history and no inequality with response to exacerbating levels of income inequality, exacerbating levels of single motherhood, personal decision-making, or any of the other variables that could come into creating the gaps we see today.
Decades after the Civil War, many government
Inequality, exacerbating levels of single motherhood,
Yeah, the increasing levels of single motherhood among black people is largely due to the war on drugs and the crime bill. Because and I've talked about this before, when the only way to get ahead that you can see in your neighborhood is to sell drugs, then you're more likely to become a victim of the war on drugs. And then we get into the 90s and that oh so wonderful crime bill that basically made mandatory minimums, particularly for drug offenses, among other things, means that there are people in jail for selling a bag of weed for decades. They're in jail forever because the only way they could to get ahead, the only thing they could find to get ahead was to sell drugs. I mean, Dodge has told the story before of someone he worked with who, if he didn't sell well at his legitimate job, would take a week or two off and go sell drugs to make ends meet. Because if you got a family, and as I understand it, there's no indication that black people are predisposed to abandoning their family or anything like that. In fact, many traditional black families are very... this is where the racist idea of every black person's cousins with everyone else, because they keep in contact with their family. This is how traditional families were, where you had a large extended family which you kept in contact and supported each other. This was common until atomization created this suburbia, basically. But there's no indication that black people are predisposed to abandon their families. So if you're trying to feed your family, and in so doing, you're risking a long jail sentence, then for a lot of people, the dice are going to come up snake eyes and you're going to go to jail. And that means that you're abandoning that family, whether you want to or not. This is why we say, you want to fix black neighborhoods, you want to make it better for them, end the war on drugs, revoke the crime bill, and create better, more sensical policing and sentencing. Hey, PM Near Nachos. Didn't we just let all those people out of prison who went in for small drug charges? Yeah, it's not everywhere, not by a long shot. His fortune using only his wit, his amazing physique, and by pulling on a pair of bejeweled bootstraps he inherited from his great-grandfather. Yes, exactly. Collision, yeah. Yeah, Ben Shapiro will tell you he made it all on his own, but he was a piano prodigy, and that brought him some level of fame, and also he comes from a wealthy family. I mean, he started out on like third base. No wonder he's a fucking millionaire.
Personal decision-making, or any of the other variables that could come into creating the gaps we see today.
Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce.
So let's talk about redlining. Redlining became illegal in the United States as early as 1968. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act was followed by the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act of 1975, which was a predecessor to the Community Reinvestment Act. both of which were an attempt to ensure that people who are living in low-income minority neighborhoods could actually get loans. And these things were very...
So let's take a look at his sources here. The issue is that just because it's... And again, this is why you have to look at what has happened before. Historical materialism, the driving force of history. Okay, so Jamal's grandparents couldn't get a loan because of redlining. That means that they couldn't build up credit because it was that they couldn't get anything on credit. They couldn't get a degree, so they couldn't get a good job. So they were, working in less skilled jobs for their lives. So Jamal's parents probably didn't have a lot of collateral or good credit to get a loan themselves. So, more than a few minutes out being filled with existential dread. See you next time. All good, collusion. See you next time. They could have sued. Being racist in any ways is punishable by law. So PM me your nachos. You're right if you can prove it. But the problem is that the racism comes in when we have people who are applying for a loan who, the only problem is they don't have a lot of, they don't have good credit or a good job to qualify them for a good loan. My parents are white. They came from lower middle class backgrounds. They weren't able to secure a loan to buy a house until I was 12. They'd been married for 15 years at that point. So you can see how dealing with other issues and keep in mind, I'm 32 now, so this would have been about 20 years ago. They weren't able to get a loan until they were 12, until I was 12. Now imagine someone who comes from a lower class background, someone who's lived in more ghetto areas for generations, trying to get a loan. They've got less income, and maybe there is, even if we assume there's no latent racism, they still just looks like a bad investment on paper, so they get declined. Yeah, and that's the other thing. Thanks for pointing that out, Mean Ween. Some lawyers will. But again, you have to prove, you have to have some sort of evidence that it's racism. And if the bank can just say, look, they only make $20,000 a year. How am I going to give them a $50,000 loan and expect to see any money back from it? I'm not. I'm not going to do this. This is ridiculous. I'm being asked to give away charity here. I'm a bank, not a charity, or something like that. That's where the implicit racism or racism by act comes in. Redlining, and to think that redlining ended in 1968 is ridiculous. Just because they stopped saying we're not lending to black people, they just said we're not lending to poor people. And since the overwhelming majority of black people are poor, there you go.
Very effective. In 1992, researchers at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston tried to look at the data. They collected information on some 30 variables related to lending decisions. They found that virtually all of the difference between minority and non-minority denial rates was explained by those variables.
Hold on. Let me... Okay. Why would I click on a link and not want to go there? Okay. So... Does the study indicate that minority applicants on average do have a greater debt burdens, higher loan-to-value ratios, and weaker credit histories, and they are less likely to buy single-family homes than white applicants, and that these disadvantages do account for a large portion in the difference in denial rates. Including the additional information on applicant and property characteristics reduces the disparity between minority and white denials from the original reported 2.7 to 1, roughly 1.6 to 1. These factors do not wholly eliminate the disparity, since the adjusted ratio implies that even after controlling for financial, employment, and neighborhood characteristics, Black and Hispanic mortgage applicants in the Boston metropolitan area are roughly 60% more likely to be turned down than whites. This discrepancy means that minority applicants with the same economic and he's lying. He's just straight up lying. Again, PM me your nachos if you can find one with the proper credentials willing to take the case pro bono. And again, the issue is, so I don't know your history, PM me your nachos. But if you've ever been a young couple working to get by, you often don't have time to do research like this. So let's take a look here. Indeed, limited for the support of other as financial institutions operating in the Boston metropolitan statistical area. Additional information on the financial employment variables lenders have indicated are relevant to the mortgage lending decision. Requests for all applications for conventional mortgage loans made by Blacks and Hispanics and a random sample made by whites. Substantial lender cooperation resulted in very good response rate and high quality data. Okay. On average, do have greater debt burdens. Yeah, this is part of what we already read. Thus, in the end, a statistically significant gap remains, which is associated with race. So yeah, Ben just lied, just flat out lied when he said that these have helped have closed the gap. There's still a significant gap.
A reanalysis of that information found that Black-owned banks were actually lending to white-owned businesses at higher rates than they were lending to Black-owned businesses. Furthermore, if it seemed that banks were discriminating against Black borrowers on the basis of they needed to have higher credit qualifications, what you would see is lower...
You don't have to have more stringent qualifications for Black people if you already know that the vast majority of Black people aren't going to qualify for the baseline you have. If you require for a basic home loan, I don't know what the actual qualifications are, but for example, if you require that the baseline be a combined income of $50,000 a year, having been employed for 3 years, then most Black people aren't going to hit that. And if you think that these businesses, especially over the last 10 years, as we've basically been in an ongoing recession for the last 10 years, if you don't think that they made their loaning requirements more and more stringent, just in general, then you're deluding yourself. They stopped explicitly discriminating against Black people and brown people with these acts you mentioned, and just discriminated against poor people, because then it's totally with the law.
Default rates from Black clients of banks, from people who are borrowing money from banks in the Black community. There are zero studies that show any of this. So the bottom line is this. Redlining was an evil and awful policy. It was made illegal in the 1960s. By the 1980s, the banks were not lending at disproportionate rates. In fact, if you look at...
You're lying. The very study you cited said that they were still disproportionately not lending to Black and brown people. So either you didn't read the study, or you're just outright lying.
Among different communities, as Thomas Sowell has pointed out, Asian Americans get loans more easily than white Americans. That does not mean the banks are being racist toward white Americans on behalf...
No, because it's expensive for Asian people to come to America. There's a common graph, I think PragerU has used it, which shows the number of Asian people compared to like Black people and white people And there's this weird cutoff in the 60s where there's like no Asian people coming in. And that's because prior to, I can't remember the name of the act off the top of my head, but there was an act that basically made it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for Asian people to immigrate to America. So the only ones who could would be the wealthy ones who could afford to go through all the red tape. And even afterwards, again, only the wealthy ones who can afford to travel to America are the ones who would immigrate. It's not like black people who were brought over here in slave ships and then just left here. And even then, the majority of African people in America who immigrate to America these days they tend to be wealthier. So again, if the system is set up to keep minorities poor, you don't have to explicitly discriminate against minorities. You just have to discriminate against poor people.
Of Asian Americans. When it comes to college education, it is also worth noting that, yes, there were many universities that were segregated. There were many universities that did not allow black people to attend. Since the 1970s, the most prominent measure that has been used in order to admit black students to major universities across the country has been affirmative action, which actively discriminates against.
But again, if you can't get loans because you're poor, then it doesn't matter whether the university is okay accepting you or not if you can't afford to pay for it. Or if you can't get scholarships because you have to, take care of your siblings and don't have time to do schoolwork, so your schoolwork suffers. Or you have a learning disability, but everyone assumes you're just dumb because you're black, so they don't try to help you. You're ignoring all the factors that can go into why minorities, black and brown people, wouldn't have attended university, wouldn't be able to get loans, that demonstrate systemic racism, and you're just doing they can't legally be discriminated against, so there's no systemic racism. Well, no, we know they can't be legally discriminated against for their race, but there's nothing saying they can't be discriminated against for their wealth or lack thereof. And that ends up turning into racism by act.
Against people who are not black in favor of black applicants, specifically by ensuring that black applicants don't have to have the same.
Also, just a quick note about affirmative action. One thing that Benny Boy here and other conservatives will say is that affirmative action means that you have two applicants. You've got Kennedy Alphonse Studebaker III, who's been to the best private institutions, comes in a three-piece suit, very polite and friendly and very qualified. And you've got Tyrone, who comes in shorts and a wife beater with a do-rag on, and he's rude and what have you, and you're looking at these two people who say, I want to hire Kennedy, but affirmative action ties my hands. I have to hire Tyrone. No, that's not how it fucking works. Affirmative action states if you have two prospective employees who are approximately the same qualifications, maybe consider hiring the minority one because they will have worked harder to get where they are. Because a 4.0 black student has almost certainly worked harder than a 4.0 white student because of the disadvantages in minority schools and minority people getting into schools. There's just generally, that's how it works.
Same test scores or GPAs in order to get into those same schools. So not only has policy been corrected, it's been overcorrected in these areas.
Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids.
The basic assumption of this video is that if your grandparents are rich in the United States, this means that you are rich in the United States. And that if your grandparents are poor in the United States, that means that you are.
No. It means if your grandparents were rich, you're more likely to be rich. And if your grandparents were poor, you're more likely to be poor. It's not a guaranteed indicator, but it's not a guarantee, but it is an indicator, is what I meant to say. Just because your grandparents are rich doesn't mean you definitely will be rich, but you're more likely to benefit from their wealth and have a better position. There's actually a really interesting comic. Let me see if I can find it real quick. God, I don't even know what to fucking Google for it. Actually, hang on. I will let Benny Boy talk while I search.
You are poor in the United States. This is factually untrue. The reality is that income changes over time, that there are an enormous number of people in the United States by percentage who are able to rise from poor to middle class and their children from middle class to wealthy. The biggest problem that we have in the United States right now is not a historic wealth gap. The biggest problem we have is an
Again, the issue is individuals can succeed, but there are so many obstacles in their way that only the exceptional ones can succeed. Doesn't go back that far. Dang it. Wait, maybe.
income gap in the United States. And there's some fascinating statistics surrounding this. There was a Harvard study recently that showed that black males who are growing up in the same household incomes as white males were actually underperforming their white male counterparts, even in high income neighborhoods. You would think that all of this might imply racism, except for one inconvenient fact in the study. Black women who are growing up in the same high income neighborhoods as white women growing up in the same high income neighborhoods, black women were performing at exactly the same or higher rates than white women in those neighborhoods, which would suggest that there are other factors at play other than simple.
Yes, there actually is significant data that says that the majority of disparity is between men, and women tend to be better off in these situations, but there is still some disparity between black and white, or black women and white women, but it's less than the disparity between black men and white men. I've done hiring and training in multiple large companies. I promise you that affirmative action has very little to do with the hiring process, if at all. Doesn't surprise me. Again, it's supposed to basically be a tiebreaker. If you've got two applicants that are basically, the same on paper, but one is black and one is white, maybe consider, and correct me if I'm wrong, aren't there incentives for hiring minorities? I don't want to repeat, white supremacist talking points here, but I thought there were some incentives, because I know there are incentives for hiring felons and criminals who just got out of prison. I never saw a tie get broken. Okay, fair enough. I know this because a former friend of mine was complaining that he couldn't get a job because he's a felon. And our other friend, who also has worked in hiring for his job for a number of years, pointed out that if companies hire felons, they get tax breaks. So they're actually more likely to hire felons who have been released from prison or what have you, because they get tax breaks as long as they feel they can trust the felon. There was one memorable instance I remember him talking about where he put in an application at a restaurant around here. And this former friend of mine has a degree in culinary arts. So, and his felony is like 15 or 20 years old at this point. He's still a piece of shit, but he has a degree in cooking. And he went to a restaurant and put in his application, didn't put down his felony on his application. And the boss called him in for an interview and talked to him and said, look, I ran a background check and found your criminal background. I was totally gonna hire you, but you lied to me about that. So what else are you gonna lie to me about? So I can't take the risk.
Simple racism. Furthermore, the basic idea that most wealth in the United States is inherited and that millionaires are
Dodge knows who I'm talking about. He's a real piece of shit.
really only millionaires because their parents were millionaires. That really isn't true either. The vast majority of millionaires and billionaires are people whose parents were not millionaires and billionaires. Chris Hogan, who's a black financial expert, he did a survey of 10,000 people, and what he found was that of those 10,000 people, 74% of millennials believed millionaires inherited their money, 52% of baby boomers did, but only 21% of millionaires received any inheritance at all. Just 16%.
This is the comic I was talking about earlier. Fuck off. So this is Richard. His parents are doing okay. And this is Paula. Her parents, not so much. Richard's house is warm and dry. His shelves are full of books and his fridge is full of food. Paula's house is full of people and not much else. It's damp and noisy and she keeps getting sick. Richard's parents will do anything for their baby. And so will Paula's. That's why they're working 2 jobs. Richard goes to a great school, well-resourced, good kids. His teachers love their job. At Paula's schools, the class sizes are large, the class is underfunded, and looks it. Her teachers are tired, stretched thin from stress. Oh man, I need a new job. So maybe we can see why the expectations set for Richard. B+? Oh dear, we need to get you a tutor. Might be slightly different to those set for Paula. B? Hey, not bad! And over the years, all these little differences, parents paying for uni, juggling work in Polytech, still getting in debt, they start to add up, to build into something bigger. I have friends working there. I'll have a word and get you an internship. Thanks, Dad. You should be finishing your studies, not looking after me. Dad, you're sick. And because each little difference sneaks by unnoticed, yep, the loan is approved, congratulations. Look, we can't help you. We just can't help you. Maybe try easy finance? Then maybe Richard starts to believe that he deserves to be on top, that he did it all himself. Oh, you're Roger's boy, right? Oh, I've heard good things, keeping my eye on you. And maybe Paula starts to settle, learns to know her place. Okay, you've got the job, but I'm watching you, sweetie. What is the secret to your success? Excuse me, but I hope not. Less whinging, more hard work, I say. I'm sick of people asking for handouts. No one ever handed me anything on a plate. I really hope not. I love this fucking comic. I need to bookmark it so I can find it easier later. I own a coffee company, and one of my locations is inside a large tech company's construction site. And out of thousands of people working, there may be a few hundred are POC, and the higher-ups may be a handful, and it has nothing to do with education. I know people working there that have no experience or education in the field they now work in. Yeah, because a lot of jobs are gotten by people who know somebody. It's somewhat less true now, but it's definitely still an issue.
Inherited.
And it's really hard to meet the right kind of people if you are systemically excluded from higher places of learning where you can meet those kind of people.
More than $100,000, only 3% received an inheritance at or above $1 million. In reality, the best path toward wealth in this country is income mobility, not inherited wealth.
That is ignoring the concept of generational poverty and how much impact generational wealth has on someone. Again, just because you may not inherit a great deal of money from your parents doesn't mean that you're not going to benefit from them having a higher income level. And I agree, income mobility is a great path to wealth, but there's so many obstacles in the way that it's not realistic for the majority of people to pursue that, which means we're dooming the majority of people to a life of poverty.
Opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirmed.
Think about that. For every $100 in wealth a white family has, a black family has $5. That's just insane to me.
That redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances.
As it turns out, there were some complicating factors that don't get cited in this video with regard to this data. The Federal Reserve Board economists tried to explain that this data did not take account of differences that were not income-based, things like liabilities, employment history, credit record, and other relevant variables that should have been considered. It should not be particularly...
Wait, what? That's all part of how loans are considered. Those are... what?
Different circumstances.
As it turns out, there were some complicating factors that don't get cited in this video with regard to this data. The Federal Reserve Board economists tried to explain that this data did not take account of differences that were not income-based.
Is this part of... okay. Okay. Yeah. I know there's an issue with entirely driven by differences in men's, not women's outcomes. Yeah, this is what we were talking about. There's a group of families with comparable incomes. Black men grow up to earn substantially less than the white men. In contrast, black women earn slightly more than white women, conditional on parent income. Moreover, there's little or no gap in wage rates or hours of work between black and white women. We find analogous gender differences in other outcomes. Black-white gaps in high school completion rates, college attendance rates, and incarceration are all substantially larger for men than women. Black women have higher college attendance rates than white men, conditional on parental income. For men, the gap in incarceration is particularly stark. 21% of black men born to the lowest income families are incarcerated on a given day, far higher than for any other subgroup. Okay, so this is not what he's talking about there. I know that there is a concept called stickiness at the edges, where people in the poorest, like if you picture income as kind of a bell curve with, you know, a bunch of people at one end, and then it goes up and then down for people at the wealthy end for numbers of people. People tend to, if they're at either end, they tend to stay there. Wealthy people tend to stay wealthy if they're among the highest, and poor people tend to stay poor if they're among the poorest. So this is an opinion piece. The upshot, I mean, the appraiser went to Brooklyn in the 1930s to assess Bedford-Stuyvesant for the government summarized the neighborhood's prospects on a single page. Many brownstones in obsolescence and poor upkeep. Clerks, laborers, and merchants lived there, about 30% of them foreign-born, Jews and Irish mostly. Also, this colored infiltration, a definitely adverse influence on neighborhood desirability. Drew a line about around a Bedford-Stuyvesant on a map, colored the area red, and gave it a D, the worst grade possible, denoting a hazardous place to underwrite mortgages. Okay. Differences in the level of racial segregation, home ownership rates, home values, and credit scores were still apparent where these boundaries were drawn. Creation of these maps actually influenced the development of urban neighborhoods over the course of the 20th century to now? That was our primary question. Okay, I don't think this is... Hey, next SVK. Most income mobility occurs in the middle standard deviation. Yes. Yeah. This is the company top 5. Okay, whatever.
things like liabilities, employment history, credit record, and other relevant variables that should have been considered. It should not be particularly surprising that discrimination in the past has impact on the actual income of people who are living in the areas that were denied loans. That shouldn't be a major surprise. But that is not the only disparity, obviously. That New York Times piece they are citing says, quote, they estimate the maps account for 15 to 30% of the overall gaps in segregation and home ownership that they find between the highest risk area and the second highest risk areas. Those were the ones that were being classified. The truth is that when it comes
If I was getting paid 15 to 30% less than my coworkers for doing the exact same job because of where I happen to have been born, I would consider that a major discrepancy and an issue. So even if it's only 15 to 30%, that's still a significant difference that needs to be accounted for, that needs to be corrected, Ben. No one is saying that redlining is wholly responsible for the issues in black communities. As I've already said, the war on drugs and the crime bill are two major contributing factors, but redlining had its own contributions.
When it comes to redlining, you have to look at the gradations as well. There is always going to be a difference in the availability of loans to people who are living in the highest risk areas as opposed to the people who are in the very...
But they were deemed high risk because they were minority. And because of the policies of the time, they weren't able to easily make the kind of income or get the kind of loans that would allow them to make the kind of changes that would make the areas have more curb appeal. And that's ignoring the fact that they'd have to work two jobs, so they wouldn't be home in time to do these changes or have the money to make these repairs.
Very lowest risk areas. Another factor is that if history does make a difference, then if you are denied loans in a particular area, and if there's less money in those areas, and as crime goes up, and as property taxes kick in, there's not enough money to take, and as schools get worse, obviously that's going to continue to have effect in that particular area. That doesn't mean the same people are living in that area who always lived in that area, or that people who grew up in that area in 1960 necessarily have to live in that area, or that their grandkids have to live in that area in 2020.
So I think what he's trying to say here is that because people can move in and out of an area, it's not the system's fault that an area is still underdeveloped or some bullshit. Because even if there is churn in the people living in an area, even if families move out, families move in, that means that they're probably moving in because that's where they can afford. And if that's where they can afford, then that means that there's probably not people helping them to improve things. Ben is a smart guy. He's Harvard educated. As much of a shit that he is an intelligent person. So that's why I'm accusing him of lying about these things, because he's smart enough to know better.
Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have.
Yeah, look at those.
Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society.
White people can't dance, Hispanics love tacos, Asians are good at math, black people are lazy, women are emotional. These are statements that even non-racist people can believe. Like, people who legitimately, sincerely, and earnestly believe all people are equal, that we can... But, some black people are lazy. Asians are good at math. That kind of idea that even if, again, someone sincerely believes in, like, Black Lives Matter and that the way black people are treated by society is abhorrent, and they're sincerely believe themselves to be non-racist, they can still harbor these implicit biases. And even things like Asians are good at math, which most people consider a positive thing, or relatively neutral things like Hispanics love tacos and white people can't dance and women are emotional, those still create biases in your interactions with these people. And whether they're good or bad, these prejudice biases, in the sense prejudged, create worse outcomes. So that's why we're trying to fight against them. He's saying the denying of a loan is based on richness of the area itself, not the ethnicity of a person. Right. White guy and African American who died the loan either way. So, yes, that is what he is saying next SVK, that these areas are, the people coming from these areas are denied loans because of their income. But the issue is that the majority of black people, as one example, are these low income. So even if occasionally white people get hit with these get denied these loans because they're low income, it's going to disproportionately affect black and brown people. But he's ignoring that and just saying, well, it's because they're from low income, and it's ignoring the fact that they're low income because of redlining, because of systemic discrimination over the last 100 years, over the last 400 years, but especially the last 100.
People are not aware that they have.
One of the big problems with implicit bias, it is very, very difficult to quantify, identify, and studies that supposedly determine that your implicit bias results in real-world action are deeply flawed. Implicit bias assessment tests, for example, are so significantly flawed they are virtually unusable.
Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names.
The research is actually a lot more interesting than what is being portrayed in this video. There are several studies.
Because there are more black people living in those areas next SVK. There are more black people living in these undesirable or dangerous areas than there are white people in general. That's why it affects black people more than white people. And what we're really kind of trying to do is create a system where it will help both black and white people. It's just white people don't really need the help as much.
Here. There was one famous study that was done that suggested that first name differentiation was indeed being used by employers. So if your name was Lakeisha, for example, this is the name that is actually used in the study, Lakeisha versus Greg, that you are less likely to get a callback. There was another study that showed a historically black last name like Washington or Jefferson provided no actual differentiation from historically white names, like Greenberg, for example. So
that study was basically done to muddy the waters, and the second study, from what I've heard, has basically been done to muddy the waters about the first study. Because, yes, Washington and Carver and what have you are traditionally black last names because they were given to them after they were freed from slavery. But it doesn't change the fact that Jamal Washington is going to be discriminated against, whereas Kevin Washington is not. And the first name is much more relevant in your dealings. You're completely ignoring that first names are more indicative of what kind of person you were raised in, the environment you were raised in and whatnot. Well, yes, but if there are more black people living in the area, obviously it will affect more black people per capita, but proportionally it is the same? No, I don't think... What do you mean by proportionally it is the same? it's going to affect more black people in these poor areas. It's going to there are more poor black people, or the greater proportion of black people are poor than the proportion of white people which are poor, even if there are more poor white people than poor black people, simply because of the differences in uh, population. But because a greater proportion of black people are poor, they're more impacted by these legislations. What if people in the area have their loan denied? Okay. Let's say there's 80% black people and 20% white people living there. Okay. Accepted premises. But we're not talking about just one area. We're talking about all of these areas which are deemed high risk or dangerous to loan to. So if one area is 80% black, one area is 72% black, one area is 60% black, one area is 98% black, it's not proportionally the same. Am I misremembering what proportionally means? In a way that corresponds in size or amount to some. Yeah, proportional to what? Okay, I understand what you're saying there now. Yes, so 100% of black people in an area get denied and 100% of white people get denied. But it still more greatly impacts black people because this happens in other areas. Because we can't compare the proportions to a given area, we have to look at its impact, at least throughout the city or municipality it's in, and ideally throughout the country. So even though, yes, all of them get denied, and this happens over and over again, and it disproportionately, from a national population standpoint, affects black people, right? And that's a problem. That's something we need to work to fix. I mean, you're all correct so far that it affects more black people because more black people tend to live in these poor neighborhoods.
If your name was Steve Greenberg versus Steve Jefferson, you're just as likely to get a callback as Steve Jefferson. What that suggests, and this was confirmed by subsequent studies, is that the actual issue here is a question of class discrimination, not an issue of race discrimination. In other words,
and they use names like Shaniqua and Carl and whatever racist black name you can think of. Not the names people typically think of as black names will be discriminated against because they consider them lower class. This is not the argument you think it is, Ben.
In other words, the reason that people are discriminating against Lakeisha as opposed to against Steve Johnson or Steve Washington is because people are actually using the first name as a stand-in for social class. They are figuring that if you were named Lakeisha, it's because you probably came from a more impoverished background. Now,
which is still discrimination, because there's no reason to think that Steve Jefferson didn't also come from a lower class background. How do you tell someone's class by their fucking name? I mean, unless you buy into the fucking aristocracy idea of like New England and the Deep South, where they name their where the wealthy people name their kids like Kennedy Alphonse III or hoity-toity names like that. But even then, that This is post hoc rationalization. Oh yeah, we didn't go with Lakeisha because that's a lower class name. No, it's not.
This is not restricted to the black community. This happens in the Jewish community as well. If you get an applicant and the applicant's name is Ben, you might treat that applicant different than if that person's name is Ben Yamin. You might treat a Menachem different than you treat a Mike. And that is because you are trying to read into the person your perceptions of culture or perceptions of class, not really perceptions of race. That's really, really important when you look at these particular.
And if that's what they're doing, it's also really, really bad. Because they're making assumptions about someone based on their fucking name. Do you know how many bougie white people name their kid? By this logic, how many bougie white people name their kids names that either trigger the lower class because they're weird spellings, or this one I came across the other day. It was a "Am I the asshole?" thread, and the woman asked, "This woman asked, am I the asshole for making fun of, or for calling out my sister-in-law or cousin-in-law or something like that?" For making fun of my child's name and telling her that I thought her kid's name was dumb. And the person was asking if they were the asshole. Their husband was Vietnamese or partially Vietnamese, and they wanted to name their kid Van. Just fine, cool, whatever. The sister-in-law or cousin or whatever in question had named their child McKennedy. They wanted to name their kid Mackenzie. Then someone else named their kid Mackenzie, so they couldn't do that. So they decided they wanted Kennedy, but they wanted something more feminine. So they went with McKennedy. And it had a really, really goofy fucking spelling, too. And that became the whole of the thread, was people making fun of the other person's name and telling, no, you're not an asshole for this. That's a dumb name. And Van is perfectly fine. So, unless you're going to try to say that someone named McKennedy is higher class, even though it has many of the same hallmarks that most people consider things like Lakeisha have, you can't prove someone's class by their fucking name.
Studies and suggest that racial discrimination rather than class distinctions are at the basis of whatever hiring discrimination is happening here.
Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment.
Well, this tends to neglect one key factor. What did you major in? What did you study? It turns out that people who major in education aren't going to do as well as people who major in engineering. According to research from the Center on Education and the Workforce at Georgetown University, this is a quote from PBS, African-American college students are more likely to pursue majors that lead to low-paying jobs, setting up many for future debt and underemployment. Over time, these occupational choices contribute to the wealth and opportunity gap between whites and blacks that spans generations. Anthony Carnival, who's...
Yeah, again, we have an issue with people being socialized to go into, to go for degrees or go into professions that are less lucrative than others because that's what's expected of them. Again, you have to account for society's impact on people. People don't make decisions in a vacuum, Ben. People make decisions based on what they've observed around them, often in subconscious ways. I'm not trying to say that everyone takes all information in and makes a perfectly rational decision. No. There's no such thing as a perfectly rational actor. However, there are a number of people who, everyone makes observations about things in life and often get pushed towards different degrees that maybe they're told would be easier for them or better for them. And this is one of the issues in the STEM field where they, for women, not for minorities necessarily, women go into STEM fields and get treated like garbage because it's a boys' club. And then they leave, and these STEM majors, these people working in engineering or technology or whatever, ask, why don't more women join? It's because they get treated like shit in your classes. And the ones who survive the classes get treated by shit in the workforce. I also don't feel like a name is a large factor in making decisions like that. It would be one of the last things that we'll look at. Such a small factor they don't really consider being important. Throw out the Tyrones, yeah.
Is the director of the program. He says basically African Americans have been going to the right church but sitting in the wrong pew. In a way, they are using education to climb the social and economic ladder, but they're being steered toward majors that will make them low earners. So, in other words, there are several confounding factors that are not being taken into account in this video. 1, what college did you go to? 2, what did you major in? And 3, what kind of job did you get afterward?
You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism.
True. Yes. Black people are overwhelmingly represented in prison and in low-income areas, and underrepresented in political forces and in academia.
We reach the crux of the matter. The basic idea here is that any inequality can be chalked up to systemic racism. We are now ghost hunting. Notice, they've said nothing in this video about incarceration. Nothing about incarceration. The simple assumption is that if more black people percentage-wise are arrested than white people, that must be due to systemic racism and not due to the number of crimes being committed by individuals.
And here we go with the blacks are more likely to commit crimes, which statistically they are, but this is due, again, to a number of factors, including over-policing. There's actually been a couple of things I've read about how poor communities tend to have more likely to still have lead paint, which can lead to more antisocial behavior. In fact, once lead paint got outlawed and leaded gas got outlawed, there was a distinct drop in violent crime, just globally, or at least nationally. Like, lead is a problem, and we were using it in so many things, and it infected so many people, and there are still areas with lead paint today. And those places tend to be pretty run down, so they're places where people are more likely to accidentally consume lead. I mean, I went through a class talking about, just in brief, about the kind of things that lead abatement teams have to go through to keep them and their families safe. And it's the kind of thing where you go into a clean room, take off all of your clothes, put on your lead abatement clothes, and then go through a clean area to go do the removal of lead pipes or lead paint or what have you. And then, you know, when you go home, you do it all again with a shower and everything. There was one person the teacher talked about who didn't feel like doing all that, and his whole family tested at not lethal, but very, very, very high doses of lead. Because he was like eating his lunch in his lead abatement clothes and then taking his lunchbox and whatever home with all the lead dust and whatever that he'd picked up and transferred onto it. Lead is no joke, and it is a not insignificant factor in why poor people tend to commit more crimes. There are other reasons, capitalism, but there are definite reasons why bad people, why bad actions can come from environmental factors.
Who make a decision to commit a crime. When it comes to representation, the truth is there are many, many black Americans in Congress. We've had a black president of the United States. People choosing to run and people choosing to vote, that is an aspect of American freedom. And when it comes...
Again, individuals do not disprove a systemic issue.
When it comes to education, there are plenty of affirmative action programs that exist at virtually every major university. In fact, there are entire university systems, like the University of California, that have gotten rid of the SAT and the ACT as admissions criteria specifically because they weren't allowing enough minority students to attend. So to attribute all...
Actually, this isn't true. I've looked at this study, or something like it. And basically, it's because they weren't as useful as they thought, and a lot of places have dropped the SAT and ACTs because people weren't able to take them due to coronavirus. So they've unanimously voted to suspend SAT and ACT testing requirements through 2024 and eliminate them for California students by 2025. System could mark a turning point in long-running debate over whether standardized tests unfairly discriminate against disadvantaged students or provide a useful tool to evaluate college applicants. Admission of less prepared students, a backlash over different entry standards for different classes. It's an incredible step in the right direction, chair of the UC Board of Regents. An ex officio regent called the vote the beginning of the end for the SAT. We really are the first body to tackle this head on and say enough is enough. After conflicting presentations by experts and lengthy debate, Regents approved UC President Janet Napolitano's 5-year plan to ease out the SAT and ACT tests and develop the university system's own assessment. Under the plan, standardized test results will be optional on applicants for the next 2 years, and then eliminated for California students in year 3 and 4. By fall 2025, the UC system is aiming to have its own assessment. If none is developed by then, the university will drop the SAT and ACT tests entirely for California students and evaluate them using high school grades and a dozen other factors in its comprehensive review system. They've already suspended the requirement for fall 2021 due to test cancellations triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. The debate featured divergent views among regents, researchers, and campus officials. UC Berkeley Chancellor Carol Christ and Yolande Copeland Morgan, UCLA Vice Provost for Enrollment Management, criticized the tests as barriers to less advantaged students. Has prospered using the current admissions process, winning top rankings for helping low-income first-generation underrepresented students succeed. The UC system make the test optional for a few years, then pause to study the effects on students rather than approve a 5-year plan. Called for a vote to immediately eliminate or keep the test rather than kick the can down the road. So yeah, this is basically because there are some indications that the SAT and ACT disproportionately disadvantage, black and brown people, minority people, then maybe this can help. So this will be an excellent test study.
Inequality to systemic racism is simply to say that everything you don't like must be due to systemic racism.
Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases.
We should always, as decent people, be re-examining our own biases and trying to wipe out bad thoughts we may be having about other people. But the idea that something as vague as you had a bad thought about a group is now responsible for the
Oh my God. No, Ben, it's not you had a bad thought and that made things harder for black people. It's that people continually have these bad thoughts, and those bad thoughts led to them being more racist.
income inequality between black and white.
Or more accurately, it led to them removing opportunities from denying opportunities to minority people. Well, I'm not going to offer this to Jamal because, he doesn't want to work that hard. Or I don't want to talk to Sarah about this because she'll get emotional about it. Or, go ask Win for help with that. He's good at math. Those kind of little actions add up over time and create the issues that we see today.
Is sort of an absurd contention.
Hey, OT Marty, welcome in. Comp ramp meme ableist? Not really. Not as far as I understand it. Because the issue is we're questioning whether he has the mental and physical capability to perform the job, not whether he's bad because he's weak or physically disabled or whatever.
In the absence of any available evidence.
What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today.
It is certainly plausible that slavery and Jim Crow have affected how people's paths have gone in life and the circumstances of their birth. But the question is, how much? If we are going to change policy, and if we are going to effectuate change, shouldn't we be focused more on what are the bad policies today that specifically are keeping people down?
So this is where Ben gets away with claiming that he's not racist. He just wants to know exactly what's wrong. He's looking for the explicit racism. Denying implicit racism or racism by act can even be things that can happen. And in so doing, all he wants to do is eliminate the aesthetics of racism and not the effects of racism.
And what behaviors can we change today to make our opportunities better rather than focusing in on slavery or Jim Crow? The fact is that even if you buy into the entire narrative of systemic racism promoted by this video, it changes nothing, and the video is even acknowledging as much.
As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources.
The suggestion that simply pouring money into public schools is somehow going to be the solution has been belied by nearly every independent study ever done of public education. Obviously, we should be spending...
Really? I don't see any studies here about putting more money into schools not helping. Cite your source there, Ben. Why else do you think it is that wealthy majority white schools do better, have better schools, tend to turn out better students, students who go on to do better things, than poorer majority minority schools? Please explain.
More on schools where not enough spending is going on, where there aren't school books or there aren't enough desks. But the real problem that's existing in educational performance has very little to do with income and a lot more to do.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you on that, Dodge. I think a lot of people look at, I've seen my grandparents do the same kind of motions that Trump made, like when he was drinking, when he was taking the drink and he had to use his other hand to get it all the way to his mouth. Or I haven't actually seen video of him shuffling down the ramp or whatever, but I can envision it. And I've seen like my grandparents do that. And it's just a concern about people that old being in positions of power because but it's not necessarily that they can't do the job. It's just, I agree, a lot of hay is made about it because it goes into this incompetency argument about him. Yeah.
With the access to educational opportunity provided.
It doesn't, next SVK. A good student is going to succeed no matter what. Like a good, hardworking student is probably going to succeed no matter what school they go to. But when you consistently have good students or students who go on to go to good schools, do good jobs, that kind of thing, consistently coming out of the same school, whereas a different school in the same city consistently has issues with students not graduating or coming out and not going to good schools. There's one of two things. Either there's a systemic issue in the way those two schools are handled, or all the really good, hardworking people happen to live in the first school's district. Just total accident, and we need to break up to break up those neighborhoods and force them to move and crossbreed with other districts. I mean, there's kind of one of the two issues. I have hip injury and I'm 37. I would shuffle the same damn way. My issue with Trump about 98% of the things that come out of his mouth on Twitter feed are idiotic or straight up dog whistles. True. and great at teaching, well paid, and the best of them is most. But if the students don't care, skip classes, ignore the teacher won't be able to help them. But that's just it. You tend not to have those issues with kids not caring at wealthier schools. There are still definitely kids who don't care at wealthier schools, but they tend not to be an issue. Whereas at poorer schools, that tends to be more of an issue, and that is a systemic problem. It's an issue with parents not holding their kids accountable, with the system, the school not having the resources to hold the kids accountable for being in school. It's not having access to after-school activities, whether through the school or through the community, to keep kids entertained so they don't get into trouble or get into issues which may prevent them from continuing to go to school. Again, we can't solve systemic issues by focusing on individuals. And by focusing on individuals, Benny Boy here is ignoring the system that causes it.
I did. In homes, if you have a single family home, it is very difficult for mom to be able to help with homework. If you don't allow kids to go to better schools outside their neighborhood, rather than simply pouring money into failed neighborhood schools, then you're not really granting opportunity.
They're only failed because they don't have the money. Maybe if they had the money to make those repairs they need, to get updated curriculum, to hire more teachers so they could have smaller class sizes, maybe they wouldn't be so failed, Ben. I mean, it's at least worth a shot instead of just shuttling kids to other schools and letting the people who's forced to stay in those neighborhoods rot.
Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
It's easy enough to say that we all have a role in making the system better, but when you suggest very few practical solutions other than rote democratic policies that have been failed nearly every time they've tried, it makes it difficult to believe this isn't just a political ploy.
When have they tried to funnel more money into poor schools? Please explain this to me. Because every time it's been tried, it's been watered down into vouchers and charter schools, both of which are worse than the current system. What rote democratic policies are you referring to here, Ben?
Rather than an argument in favor of bettering individual human lives. To deny the effects of history would be idiotic. History obviously has consequences. And to deny that racism exists would be similarly idiotic. But to attribute every problem in American life to racism or inequity is to be foolish and counterproductive and not to make the world a better place. For more on a lot of these topics, go check out my brand new book, How to Destroy America in 3 Easy Steps, all about the attempt.
Done with Ben Schilling here. Yeah, so there are a number of factors which lead to issues in schools, and there are a number of relatively easy to implement things that could fix them if we can get the political will. Unfortunately, with Trump in power, I don't think that's going to happen. Hey, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the show. Remember to like, share, and leave a comment because it helps me. Subscribe and ring that bell to help you. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.